The Chinese armed forces are one of the most impressive military machines of our times. But these forces would hardly exist if it weren't for the doctrines that emerged from the minds of men who fought bravely between the years 1920 and 1950. The Maoist military doctrine that we will learn about today.
A doutrina militar maoísta que nós vamos conhecer hoje. Olá, combatentes do canal Doctrine. No vídeo de hoje nós vamos falar.
Hello, fighters of the Itai channel. In today's video, we are going to talk about one of the least known military doctrines in the West, but one that has influenced the history of many countries. We are talking about the Maoist doctrine. Let's get to know a bit of its intricacies. Well, here's what happens. The Chinese revolutionary leader Mao Zedong developed his doctrines, his ideas. He didn't do this alone, we have no doubt about that. We need to remember that the Communist Party had excellent generals, both during the Civil War and later in the Korean War. And Mao Zedong developed these tactics and techniques, facing Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang and the Japanese Imperial Army. So in fact, the Maoist army and its doctrines are born from practical experience. For example, we have the Long March from 1934 to 1935, where they needed, through a series of investments,
onde eles precisaram, através de uma série de embates, enfrentar as forças do Kuomintang, que eram muito mais poderosas e muito mais bem armadas, né? E ele consegue
powerful and much better armed, and he manages to save a good part of the Chinese Communist Army. Well, one of the basic principles is that armed struggle is inseparable from the support of the masses. So, Mao used to say the following: "The army is the fish, but the sea is the people. If you don't have the support of the people, you can't sustain this war." And the war he envisioned is divided into several phases. So first, there is the strategic defense. The guerrilla retreats and seeks to wear down the enemy. That's what they did in the Long March. They retreat to the remote region of China and carry out a series of operations, prolonged attrition of the Kuomintang army and Chiang Kai-shek. What happens next? Then comes the strategic balance. They consolidate their bases and start making attacks with a little more intensity, until the final phase, which is the strategic offensive, which was after World War II.
A fase final aí, que é a ofensiva estratégica, que foi depois da Segunda Guerra Mundial. Eles partem para a guerra convencional, vão tomando cidades.
They engage in conventional warfare, taking over cities and large regions of the state. And Mao used to say, if the enemy advances, we retreat. If he camps, we harass. When he gets tired, we attack. The enemy retreats, we pursue him. So what happens? He tries to avoid decisive battles. If we look at this, the war tactics, the overall Russian strategy in the Ukraine war, has a bit of Mao in it. They try to find the weaknesses of the Ukrainian army and only launch a general offensive when they really have a condition of local superiority. Mao also made very intense use of the terrain, mountains, forests, and rivers, both for ambush and for rapid dispersion. But for that, you need to know the terrain well. And that's where Mao's popular support also comes in.
Aí entra também aquele apoio popular do Mao. O apoio popular é indispensável, não só no fornecimento de suprimentos.
Popular support is indispensable not only for providing supplies, reinforcements, etc., but also for understanding and knowing the region. The Maoist army sought to have minimal dependence on external resources, achieving self-sufficiency with an emphasis on local production of weapons and supplies in peasant bases. This principle of self-sufficiency is still used today by North Korea. They may not emphasize it much, but there is a lot of Maoism in North Korea's military philosophy. Another important aspect, another principle, is the subordination of military power to political power. So what happens? The party has significant control over the army. No one steps out of line, so much so that we must remember that even in modern China today, the army is subordinate to the party. Now we need to talk a bit about the Maoist army, because they focus not only on tactics, but also on social transformation.
Eles não focavam apenas nas táticas, mas na transformação social. Então havia clima ali de muito igualitário.
There was a strong sense of egalitarianism within the Chinese army. War was not an end in itself. It was a means to achieve an end, which was the victory of the communist revolution and what they understood as the liberation of the people. There was also something very important in Maoism, which is ideological discipline. The soldiers were thoroughly indoctrinated to understand the reasons and the whys of each decision the party made. At this point, we also need to talk about the operational tactics of the Maoist army. Guerrilla warfare, small groups of 10 to 50 men attacking vulnerable targets, convoys, posts, remote bases, etc., with dispersion immediately afterward. We must remember that this tactic was widely used by the Viet Cong army in the guerrilla warfare in South Vietnam.
Na guerrilha aí no Vietnã do Sul. E eles usavam muitas armas leves aí, né? Fuzis,
And they used many light weapons, rifles, homemade grenades, at most a 60mm mortar, and captured enemy equipment. This technique was used not only by the Viet Cong, but the Taliban also employed these tactics a lot in the Afghanistan war against the Americans during those 20 years of war. Now, a very important thing, the Maoists see the mobilization of the masses as crucial. So the people are not used just as militia, they are spies, they are carriers. They provide knowledge of the terrain, they help the logistical base, but for this, the party needs to give something in return, a reward. So they carried out land reform in the controlled areas, and sought to establish governments and justice, even with considerable efficiency.
Com bastante eficiência. Quando você faz isso, quando você melhora as condições de vida da população.
When you do that, when you improve the living conditions of the local population, it's logical that they will support your cause. And the Maoists also heavily relied on the prolonged attrition of the enemy. So, for example, they carried out several attacks and avoided unnecessary losses. And an interesting thing we need to remember is that in the Chinese Revolution, they accepted entire Kuomintang armies that defected to their side and welcomed these people. A very interesting characteristic of the Maoists. Many Kuomintang officers ended up fighting in Mao's forces. Now, folks, this is quite important. It's very difficult to find documentation about nationalist military personnel who defected to the communist side.
Nacionalistas que desertaram para o lado comunista. É muito raro achar isso aí, mas há casos documentários.
It's very rare to find that. But there are documented cases of generals even who switched sides and were welcomed by the communists. However, since the press mainly is dominated by the United States, this information is very difficult to obtain. I found out about this when I watched that documentary about the Korean War going across the Yalu River and started to find some bits of it. But it's hard to find material on the subject, though it exists. On the Chinese side, this is well documented, and they played an important role in the fight against their former nationalist comrades. I recently did some research that talks about some important generals who defected to the communist side and were decisive.
Para o lado comunista e que foram decisivos. Então, por exemplo, você tem esse general aqui, tá?
So, for example, there's this general here, Han Yuan. He was a Muslim from Xinjiang, and he defected to the communist side and helped Mao's communists hold the Xinjiang region. Also, in the Weihai campaign, several Kuomintang officers and troops, various nationalist contingents, defected to the communist side and significantly impacted the battle's outcome in favor of Mao Zedong's troops. Now, if we look at it from a logistical and technological perspective, Chiang Kai-shek's army always had superiority. Kai-shek had very good equipment. We need to remember that many of Kai-shek's military personnel were trained, including by the Nazi German army. But after 1945, the Soviets delivered a lot of material to Mao Zedong's troops.
Os soviéticos entregaram muito material para as tropas do Mao Tse-tung. Esse material foi importantíssimo aí para os.
This material was extremely important for the offensives that lasted until 1949, when they effectively took power in China. Well, I think, as has already been noted, Maoist military philosophy influenced the Vietnamese, Cubans. If we look to a greater or lesser extent at the guerrillas in the Middle East, I've already mentioned Afghanistan there too, the guerrillas in the Middle East were also influenced by Maoism. I think it's very important for us to study these doctrines because there is a lot of important information to be gained there, not only in military matters, but also in political matters. Well, folks, I'm going to recommend some books here for you to learn a little more about the Revolutionary War in China. Since this one is in Spanish, you can see it's quite old. Mao Zedong, Problems of War and Strategy.
Mao Tse-tung, Problemas da Guerra e da Estratégia. Problemas da Guerra e de Estratégia. Esse aqui vocês até conseguem achar.
This one you can actually find. It's by Daniel Otto Race, about the Chinese Revolution. This book is very good. It's worth taking a look at it. This one is also easy to find. You can find it on Amazon and other sites. The Long March, which talks about the withdrawal of Mao's troops. And this one too, Mao Zedong's Little Red Book. It's interesting for you to take a look. Now this one is extremely rare, very hard to find, but it's the best. Revolutionary Wars, Cuba, Greece, and China. It's a study by the Brazilian Army Staff Command School from 1976, a year after Brazil established diplomatic relations with China. But the summary is excellent. They did a very well-done analysis, a very technical analysis of the Chinese Revolution. I will also recommend a book that is not about the Chinese Revolution, but I know you can find it, and it has everything to do with it. Related to Maoism, which is Victory in Vietnam, the history of the Vietnamese army. It's interesting because they mention that when the Americans arrived in Da Nang in 1965, when the Marines got there, there were already 4 regiments of the North Vietnamese Army operating in the south. So the Americans completely underestimated the work of the Vietnamese army, which was one of the factors that led to losing the Vietnam War. You can find all these books on the Amazon wish list. Every time you buy books and other items on Amazon, you are helping the Arte de Guerra channel. We'll be back shortly, okay? Always with responsibility and commitment. Faith in Brazil, folks. See you later.
Fé no Brasil, pessoal. Até mais.
Captioned by Sonia Ruberti.